The air in the lawyer's office felt too still, like the world was holding its breath. I sat at the edge of my chair, my palms flat on my knees, listening to the soft shuffle of papers. My brother Daniel lounged back with a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. He'd come dressed like he was attending his own victory ceremony, a sleek suit, polished watch, and that arrogant confidence that had always made him our father's golden boy. I tried not to look at him, but his reflection in the glass table mocked me. Everyone in the room already knew how this would go. Daniel ran the business. Daniel made the money. Daniel could do no wrong. Me? I was the quiet one who stayed behind, who took care of our father in his final months while Daniel sent texts from overseas. The lawyer cleared his throat. His voice was calm, rehearsed. Mr. Whitmore's estate has been divided into two main assets. The business, Whitmore and Sons Manufacturing, will pass to Daniel Whitmore. Daniel exhaled loudly, grinning as if he'd won a prize. As expected, he said, leaning back even further. His wife let out a small laugh. My stomach twisted. The lawyer continued. To Michael Whitmore, the younger son, your father leaves the family residence located on Oak Ridge Lane. There was silence, just long enough for humiliation to settle in. Daniel turned to me, his grin widening. The old house? He said, laughing so hard it echoed off the walls. You mean the one with the leaky roof and dead garden? Oh, congratulations, little brother. A true empire, the others chuckled politely. I could feel my face heat, but I forced myself to stay still. My father's voice echoed in my mind from one of his final days. Don't measure value in what shines. I didn't understand it then. I wasn't sure I did now. Daniel slapped the table, still laughing. Guess Dad finally rewarded hard work. You always loved that dusty place. Now you can live there forever. The lawyer's expression barely changed, though his eyes flickered toward me, almost apologetic. There are additional notes and documents, he said, which will be provided to each of you separately. Daniel didn't hear him, or didn't care. He stood and shook the lawyer's hand like a man accepting a crown. I'll take good care of the company, he said loudly, making sure everyone heard. After all, Dad knew who was capable. Capable. That word stung deeper than his laughter. I had spent nights by our father's bedside while Daniel chased business deals and parties. I held his hand when he couldn't speak, and still, here I was, dismissed as the sentimental son with a broken house. As the others left, Daniel clapped me on the back. Don't look so down. You've got a roof over your head. Just don't let it collapse. He grinned, then strode out, his cologne lingering like arrogance in the air. The lawyer waited until the room emptied. He gestured for me to stay seated. Your father spoke very highly of you, Michael, he said softly. He wanted you to have something that would remind you of where you came from. I nodded, my throat tight. Something that doesn't make sense right now, I muttered. He smiled faintly. Sometimes it takes time to see a man's intention. He trusted you to look deeper. When I finally stepped outside, the sunlight felt harsh, almost accusing. Daniel stood near his car, shaking hands with a few business associates, laughing loudly, already celebrating. I looked down at the copy of the will in my hands. The old family house. To him, it was worthless. To me, it was suddenly heavy with something else. Something I couldn't yet name. I turned away and walked toward my car, each step echoing with a strange mix of shame and curiosity. Whatever my father meant by this, I would find out. The restaurant my brother chose for the family dinner was the kind of place that whispered money. Gold-trimmed menus, soft piano music, waiters gliding like shadows. Daniel always loved being seen in places like this, especially when he could be the loudest one in the room. I almost didn't go, but curiosity or maybe pride pulled me there. I wanted to see what triumph looked like in his eyes now that he had everything. He and his wife Clara were already seated when I arrived. They greeted me with matching smiles, sharp, insincere. There he is, Daniel said, standing just enough to make a show of it. The proud owner of the Whitmore mansion. How's the plumbing holding up? Clara laughed, a little too loud. Oh, Daniel, don't tease him. I'm sure he'll make it cozy. Maybe he can rent it out to tourists who want to experience vintage poverty. The waiter appeared, and Daniel ordered an expensive bottle of wine before I could even open the menu. "My treat," he said, flashing his new company card like a trophy. "Business is already booming." He turned to me. "Maybe one day I'll buy that old place from you, turn it into a parking lot for my employees." I forced a smile, though my jaw ached from holding it. Every word felt like a test. They wanted me to snap, to prove that I was still the quiet, sensitive brother who couldn't handle ridicule. "I'm fine with what Dad left me," I said finally. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "It's not about what's valuable to everyone else." Daniel raised his glass, smirking. "Heritage over wealth, right? That's what Dad always said. But guess what? Heritage doesn't pay the bills." Clara leaned in, eyes gleaming. "It's sweet, though, that you still believe all that sentimental stuff. Some people just aren't built for business." Their laughter filled the space between us. I stared down at the tablecloth, tracing invisible lines, willing myself not to react. Every insult reminded me of that hospital night when Dad whispered those same words, heritage over wealth. At the time, I thought it was just comfort for a dying man. Now, sitting across from Daniel's smug grin, I realized maybe he'd meant something else entirely. The food arrived, beautiful plates of perfection, but everything tasted bitter. Daniel bragged through every bite. New contracts, bigger offices, investors calling him a genius. Clara nodded proudly, the perfect partner to his ego. When the check came, he pushed it toward me with a laugh. "You don't mind covering the tip, do you? Oh wait, maybe fix that roof first." That was the moment I almost lost it. My hands trembled under the table, but I breathed in, slow and deliberate, and thought of my father's steady voice, of the quiet dignity he carried even when people underestimated him. "I'll be fine," I said, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Houses can be rebuilt, reputations. Not always." For a split second his smile faltered, then he waved it off, pretending not to understand. As they left, laughing down the hallway, I sat alone for a while. The humiliation burned, but underneath it, something else began to stir, something cold and patient. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner wasn't the end of my shame. It was the beginning of my resolve. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the old Whitmore house looked even smaller than I remembered. The paint had peeled in wide, tired strips, and ivy clung to the sides like it was trying to hold the place together. A loose shutter banged softly in the wind. Most people would have seen a ruin, but as I stepped out of the car, a strange comfort spread through me, like the air itself recognized me. The door creaked the same way it always had. The smell hit me instantly. Dust, old books, a faint trace of Dad's pipe tobacco. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I was 10 years old again, running down the hallway while Mom called after me to take off my muddy shoes. The silence that followed now felt thick and sacred. Every corner held ghosts, but not the kind that scared you, the kind that remembered you. The living room was exactly as Dad had left it. His favorite armchair sat by the window, a blanket folded neatly across it. The mantel still held Mom's porcelain clock, forever frozen at 2:14. The time she passed, I'd always believed. I brushed the dust off a framed photo of all of us, taken long before money and pride had split us apart. Daniel's smile looked real then. Mine did too. I wandered into Dad's study, the room where he'd spent hours poring over ledgers and letters. The faint scent of old paper lingered, like time itself hadn't dared disturb this space. His desk stood against the far wall, heavy and scarred from decades of use. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling the grooves his pen had carved into the wood. For a long while, I just sat in his chair, staring out the same window he had. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty glass, painting long, golden bars across the floor. I imagined him there, writing, thinking, maybe worrying about us. Had he known how divided we'd become? Had he known Daniel would laugh at his final wishes? I opened a few drawers, mostly filled with pens, receipts, and old letters. But when I tugged at the bottom one, it caught. I pulled harder, and the panel inside shifted slightly. Behind it was a small hollow space, one I'd never seen before. My pulse quickened. Inside, wrapped in yellowed parchment, was a thick envelope with my name written on it in Dad's careful handwriting. For a moment, I just stared at it. The paper felt warm, almost alive. My name looked older somehow, written by a hand that had known both pride and worry. I could have opened it right then, but something inside me said no. Not yet. Instead, I placed it gently on the desk and leaned back. The house creaked softly, as if exhaling. Maybe I needed to earn whatever truth that envelope carried. Maybe Dad wanted me to sit with the silence first, to remember who we were before greed took over. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the house began to hum with a different kind of energy. Not the cold loneliness I expected, but something protective, almost watchful. I lit the old fireplace for the first time in years. The flame flickered across the room, dancing over photos and books. It was strange watching Daniel's face become a brand. Everywhere I turned, billboards, social media feeds, even TV interviews, there he was, flashing that perfect grin that used to charm teachers and terrify competitors. Whitmore Enterprises, a legacy reinvented, the headline said. I couldn't scroll for 5 seconds without seeing him posing in front of sleek cars, champagne glasses in hand, surrounded by people who clapped a little too hard. He'd taken Dad's steady, honest business and turned it into a glittering show. Every new post felt like another performance, every smile another act. He talked about vision and modern leadership, but I knew what it really was. Ego wrapped in designer suits. Still, I couldn't deny a part of me felt a sting. I'd grown up walking those factory floors, listening to Dad talk about fairness, craftsmanship, loyalty. Now it was just hashtags and sponsorships. I told myself not to look, but curiosity has its own gravity. One night, I found myself watching one of his live speeches. He stood under bright lights, preaching about ambition, hard work, and the courage to chase your destiny. I almost laughed. I wanted to scream that he'd inherited everything, that courage had nothing to do with it. But instead, I just closed the laptop and looked around at my silent, half-restored house. It was easy to feel small in those moments. The world seemed to applaud him, while I scraped wallpaper off damp walls. Yet, as days passed, I started noticing something shift inside me. There was peace in the rhythm of work. My hands, once soft from office life, grew rough with calluses. I patched the roof myself, fixed the creaking steps, sanded the floors until they gleamed faintly in the morning light. Neighbors stopped by, sometimes curious about the crazy one living in the old Whitmore place. Some offered help, others offered pity. I took neither. I worked in silence the way Dad used to. Every nail I drove in felt like reclaiming a piece of what Daniel had mocked. Anger was there, of course it was, but it had changed. It no longer burned wild. It burned steady, like the fire that warmed the house at night. I didn't need to post my progress online. The house didn't care about followers or likes. It rewarded effort with stillness. Each day I peeled back another layer of decay and found something familiar underneath. My parents' spirit, my own resilience, the truth of what heritage meant. Sometimes I'd pause in the evenings, hands covered in paint, and think about Dad's last words, heritage over wealth. They echoed through the empty halls, and for the first time, I understood them. Daniel had inherited a kingdom of glass. I'd inherited roots. When I finally restored the study, I placed the unopened envelope back on the desk, where the sunlight touched it every morning. It became my compass, my quiet reminder that the story wasn't over yet. While Daniel chased headlines, I built something real. My empire wasn't made of money or marble. It was made of patience, memory, and the steady beat of my father's promise. And though no one was watching, I felt something powerful rising in the silence. The calm before a reckoning. Family dinners became minefields. I used to look forward to them. Laughter, stories, the smell of roast beef and wine. But now they were just stages for Daniel's performance. He'd stroll in late, dressed like a magazine ad, keys to his newest car dangling from his fingers, and somehow every conversation found its way back to him. He had a gift for that, turning any topic into a reflection of his success. When relatives asked how I was doing, I'd mention the house restoration. Their polite smiles told me everything. "That's nice," Aunt Carol would say, her eyes drifting toward Daniel's expensive watch. My cousin whispered once that I'd lost my mind, living in a crumbling relic instead of joining the family business. Daniel overheard and laughed, adding, "He's always been sentimental. Some people build legacies, others dust off old walls." The table erupted in laughter. I forced a smile and swallowed the heat rising in my throat. Afterward, my fiancée, Clara, squeezed my hand too tightly. "You could have defended yourself," she whispered when we got home. I told her it wasn't worth it, that silence sometimes said more. But she didn't look convinced. The next few weeks, I noticed her tone changing. She'd sigh when bills came, complain about how cold the house was, how quiet the neighborhood felt. "I just thought we'd have more by now," she said one night, folding her arms. "Your brother's expanding. We're stuck." Her words cut deeper than Daniel's mockery ever could. She wasn't cruel, just tired. But hearing doubt in her voice made the walls feel heavier. I wanted to tell her about the envelope, about my growing suspicion that Dad had left more than we realized, but something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe fear that I was wrong. Daniel, of course, didn't miss a chance to twist the knife. At the next family event, he lifted his glass and toasted, "To those of us who know how to turn opportunity into success." His wife giggled, leaning close to whisper something that made him smirk at me across the table. The humiliation wasn't just public. It was personal, creeping into every corner of my life. Friends stopped calling. My name became a cautionary tale. The brother who chose nostalgia over money. But what they didn't see was that behind my forced smiles, something was hardening inside me. The laughter, the pity, the doubt, they were shaping me into someone new. I realized then that sometimes humiliation isn't destruction, it's preparation. While Daniel played king, I began to understand the power of being underestimated. I stayed quiet. I listened. I endured. And in that silence, revenge began to take root. The first rumor reached me through a neighbor who still worked at one of my brother's factories. "He's making cuts," she said quietly, almost guiltily. "People aren't getting paid on time." I brushed it off, telling myself Daniel knew what he was doing. But then another story came. Suppliers threatening lawsuits, workers walking out, clients demanding refunds. His empire, so loud and polished, had begun to crack. One evening, as I was sanding the hallway banister, I heard a knock on the door. Standing there was Mr. Harris, our father's old accountant. He looked thinner, older, his tie loose as if he'd run straight from work. "I had to see you," he said, stepping inside. "Your father would have wanted me to." He sat at the kitchen table, eyes scanning the familiar wallpaper, the family portraits still on the wall. "I tried to warn Daniel," he murmured. "He's taking shortcuts, false invoices, unpaid vendors, risky loans. He calls it aggressive growth. Your father called it greed." I listened in silence, the house creaking softly around us. "Why tell me?" I finally asked. Mr. Harris's gaze met mine, steady and heavy with meaning. "Because your father trusted you more than anyone," he said. "He knew Daniel couldn't handle power without losing himself. That's why he left you this house. It's more than just land. It's what anchors the family's true inheritance." His words hit me like thunder. All this time, I'd thought the house was a consolation prize, a symbol of being overlooked. But what if it was the opposite? What if my father had known something Daniel didn't? Mr. Harris pulled out an old ledger and slid it across the table. "Your father told me, When things start to fall apart, go to him. He'll know what to do. My throat tightened. I remembered Dad's voice, calm and deliberate, the last time we spoke. Heritage over wealth, son. One lasts longer. When Mr. Harris left, I sat there for a long time, the envelope still hidden in my desk drawer, my fingers itching to open it. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, a storm brewing both in the sky and in Daniel's glittering kingdom. For the first time, I didn't feel humiliated or small. I felt chosen. My father's trust had been quiet, but absolute. And as his words echoed through the old house, I finally understood. What Daniel built on greed was already starting to crumble. What I was restoring, slowly and patiently, was about to outlast him all. For weeks, the envelope had sat like a ghost in the drawer, silent, waiting, almost humming with unspoken truth. That night, the wind howled through the broken shutters, the house whispering with old voices. I sat at my father's desk, hands trembling slightly as I pulled it out. The paper had yellowed with time, the handwriting on the front unmistakably his, my name written with calm precision. For when you're ready. I hesitated, remembering how he used to sign every important document with that same pen, the same steady hand that had once guided both of us through life. My heart pounded as I broke the seal. Inside, there were several documents, property deeds, maps, legal letters, and finally, a folded handwritten note. I laid them out carefully, my eyes scanning unfamiliar names, coordinates, and figures until a single sentence stopped me cold. All commercial leases tied to the old family estate remain valid only under the authority of its rightful heir. I read it again, slower this time. The house, my house, the one everyone mocked as worthless, was sitting on land that controlled the foundation of my brother's empire. I unfolded the letter. Dad's handwriting flowed across the page like a quiet conversation from the grave. My sons, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Daniel will chase the world as he always has. But you, my thoughtful one, you understand that roots matter more than branches. The business was built on this land. The contracts, the expansions, even the rights to build, all tied to the estate's ownership. Without it, nothing stands, my breath caught. I flipped through the deeds again, tracing the boundaries he'd drawn decades ago. The old estate wasn't just sentimental, it was the cornerstone. Every factory, office, and warehouse Daniel had expanded onto existed legally under lease from this land. And that lease was about to expire. The room spun as I absorbed it. The laughter, the humiliation, the pity, all of it turned to dust in my mind. My father hadn't just left me memories. He'd left me control. At the bottom of the letter, another line in his familiar ink read, "Do not seek revenge in haste. Let truth ripen. When the time comes, act with dignity. Heritage over wealth." Tears welled up in my eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from the sheer weight of realization. My father had seen through us both. He had known Daniel's hunger would blind him, and my patience would save us. I leaned back, staring at the flickering lamp, the papers glowing golden beneath its light. Every splinter in this house, every creak of the floors, now felt like a pulse of power. The rotting relic was no ruin. It was the Empire's heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. I thought of Daniel's smug grin, his lavish speeches, his ignorance of what truly sustained him. I smiled faintly. My humiliation had been my disguise, my patience, my weapon. Dad had left me not just an inheritance. He'd left me the lever that could move everything Daniel thought he owned. And soon I would decide how to use it. I barely slept that night. The papers lay spread across my desk like pieces of a puzzle I finally understood, but needed confirmed. By morning, I was sitting in the lawyer's office again, the same room where my humiliation had started. The air smelled of old books and dust, and the ticking clock on the wall reminded me of that day when Daniel laughed at my inheritance. Mr. Collins, our family lawyer, adjusted his glasses as I handed him the envelope. He studied the document slowly, lips pressed tight. I could see the recognition flicker across his face, the kind that comes from reading something both familiar and dangerous. Finally, he looked up. "Your father was a clever man," he said. "Very clever indeed. What does it mean?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. "It means," he said carefully, "that your brother's entire business empire, every building, every expansion, exists on land that your father kept under the estate. Legally, you are the landlord, and without your consent, he has no right to operate there." I stared at him, the words sinking in like sunlight breaking through fog. "So if I revoke the lease, he'd lose everything," Mr. Collins finished. "And there's more. Your father structured it this way deliberately. He told me once that he wanted to see which of his sons would value the family's integrity, not just its fortune." A chill ran through me. All those years of feeling small, of being treated like the sentimental fool. My father had been watching, testing, trusting that I would understand the weight of heritage over greed. Mr. Collins leaned forward, voice soft but firm. He said, and I quote, "If my sons ever forget where they came from, the land will remind them." I exhaled slowly, the enormity of it pressing on my chest. It wasn't just about property. It was legacy, a silent balance of justice woven into the very ground we stood on. My father hadn't punished me with sentimentality. He had armed me with time. As I left the office, the city's skyline gleamed in the distance. The towers my brother claimed as his own. They suddenly looked fragile, like glass castles built on borrowed earth. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives gossiping about Daniel's business setbacks. I didn't reply. For the first time in years, I felt no anger, just calm, inevitable certainty. Poetic justice had begun, not with shouting or revenge, but with quiet truth. The foundation beneath Daniel's empire no longer belonged to him. It never had. As I drove home, I looked at the old house through new eyes. Its walls weren't fading, they were awakening. My father's lesson echoed again, heritage over wealth. And this time it wasn't just a memory, it was power. The meeting took place in the same conference room where Daniel had once hosted his victory parties. The place I'd always felt out of place, surrounded by men in tailored suits who spoke in numbers and forecasts. This time, though, I wasn't there as an observer. Mr. Collins had arranged the meeting, inviting every shareholder, partner, and board member under the pretense of a critical legal clarification. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, leaning back in his chair with his usual confidence, tapping on his phone as his assistant adjusted his cufflinks. "Well, look who decided to visit civilization," he smirked when he saw me. "Hope the old house didn't collapse on you." Laughter rippled around the table. I said nothing, only met his gaze and smiled faintly. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "This won't take long, but it is significant." He opened a folder, spreading documents across the polished table. "It has come to our attention that several key properties, namely the company's primary headquarters, production sites, and distribution centers, are situated on land originally owned by the late Mr. Whitaker." Daniel straightened, glancing at him impatiently. Yes, the family estate. We've been through this before. My father transferred the business years ago." Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses. "Not the land, Mr. Whitaker. The deeds and lease rights were never transferred. According to the estate documents and updated filings, legal ownership belongs to your brother." The silence was immediate and absolute. Daniel blinked, forcing a chuckle. "That's absurd. He got the house, not the land." "That's precisely the misunderstanding," I said calmly. My voice didn't tremble. I reached into my briefcase and slid copies of the original deeds and lease contracts across the table. "These documents confirm that every facility you've expanded, every office bearing your name, exists under a lease tied to my property. And according to the renewal terms, those leases expired 3 months ago." A murmur rippled through the shareholders. Papers shuffled. Someone cursed under their breath. Daniel's face drained of color. "You can't be serious," he hissed. "I am," I said softly. "And so was Dad. He built his company on trust and integrity. You built yours on borrowed ground." Mr. Collins nodded solemnly. "If the leaseholder does not renew, Continued operations could constitute a breach of property law. That means the company could face injunctions, asset freezes, or even liquidation proceedings. The board members exchanged looks, whispering frantically. One of them turned to Daniel. "You said all land titles were secure." Daniel stood abruptly, slamming his hand on the table. "This is manipulation. He's jealous. He's always been jealous." I didn't move. "Jealousy doesn't sign deeds," I replied quietly. The room went still again. Daniel's confidence, that smug armor he wore like a crown, began to crumble. Sweat beaded at his temple. The shareholders, once his loyal chorus, avoided his eyes. For years, I had been the one laughed at, pitied, ignored. Now silence was my ally. The kind that carried weight, the kind that ends empires. Mr. Collins gathered the remaining papers and concluded, "Gentlemen, this meeting is adjourned. Ownership clarification will proceed as outlined by the late Mr. Whitaker's estate." Daniel sank back into his chair, staring blankly ahead, the reality finally sinking in. As I walked out of that room, every echo of my footsteps down the marble hallway felt like balance returning, slow, deliberate, and just. The first wave of revenge had been quiet. This was the sound of justice landing perfectly on time. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Within 48 hours of the meeting, the markets whispered what the press hadn't yet printed. Whitaker Industries was built on unstable ground, literally. Investors began calling in panic. Contracts were suspended, loans revoked, partnerships reconsidered. By the end of the week, Daniel's empire, the one he'd spent years parading online, was bleeding money faster than he could contain it. When I saw him again, he looked different. Gone was the gleam of confidence, replaced by restless fury. His tailored suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. "You set me up," he spat, slamming the office door behind him. "You planned this, waited until everything was perfect to humiliate me." I didn't flinch. "I didn't plan your greed," I said evenly. "That part was all you." He paced like a cornered animal. "You could have told me. You could have—" "I did," I interrupted softly. "In my own way. When I said Dad's lessons still mattered, you laughed. When I said the old house meant something, you called me sentimental." I took a slow breath, watching him struggle to find words. "You mocked what you didn't understand. And now the thing you despised most is what holds everything you built." His face twisted in disbelief, the kind that borders on grief. "You think this makes you better than me?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "It just makes me right." Mr. Collins's warnings had already reached the banks. Accounts were frozen pending legal review. Without liquidity, Daniel's operations halted. Payroll stopped. The media began circling, sensing the fall of a self-made visionary. I watched him sink into his chair, the fight leaving him. For the first time, I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who needed to win at any cost, even if it meant breaking what he inherited. "I tried to carry the family name," he muttered, staring at the floor. "No," I said quietly. "You tried to own it." Outside, flashes from reporters' cameras lit up the glass walls. The empire he'd built for admiration was now collapsing under its own spotlight. I turned to leave but paused at the door. "You once laughed at me for getting the junk property, remember?" He didn't answer, but I could see the memory flicker behind his eyes, the smirk, the mockery, the champagne. Turns out that junk was the foundation of everything you ever wanted. He said nothing, just stared at the desk, at the scattered papers, at the life he'd constructed on borrowed ground. As I stepped into the hallway, the noise of his downfall echoed behind me, phones ringing, voices shouting, the empire unraveling thread by thread. For years, Daniel had measured success by how loudly the world applauded him. But now, in the quiet aftermath, I realized my father's lesson had proven itself perfectly. Wealth fades, but truth always collects its debt. It was raining the night he came. Headlights cut through the mist as his car tore up the gravel driveway, splashing mud across the porch. I was in the study, the old lamp casting a soft glow on the papers Dad had left behind, when I heard the front door slam open. Daniel's voice echoed through the house, angry, desperate, cracked. "Fix this," he shouted, his footsteps pounding closer. "You have to fix this, damn it." He stood there in the doorway, soaked and trembling, his perfect composure gone. "You've made your point," he hissed. "You've had your revenge. But you're killing everything Dad built, everything I worked for." I looked at him for a long moment, the same brother who once laughed in this very house, who called it worthless. Now he stood surrounded by the ghosts of what he'd thrown away. "Dad built with purpose," I said quietly. "You built with ego. There's a difference." He ran a hand through his wet hair, pacing, eyes wild. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" "You destroyed me!" "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself. I just stopped protecting you from it." For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows. Then his voice cracked. "He loved you more, didn't he?" I shook my head. "He loved us both. He just knew what each of us needed to learn. Mine was patience. Yours was humility." Something broke in his expression. Pride, maybe, or the last illusion of control. He sank into the nearest chair, staring at the floor, shoulders shaking. "I thought I was honoring him," he whispered, "making his name bigger." "You made it louder," I said gently. "Not better." He looked up, eyes red, years of arrogance dissolving into something raw and human. "I don't know how to fix this." I sighed and stood, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you don't. Maybe you just start again, without pretending to be more than you are." For a long moment, he sat there, breathing unevenly, then rose slowly. His voice was barely a whisper. "Tell Dad I'm sorry," I almost smiled. "He already knows." He nodded once and walked out into the rain without another word. I watched from the porch as his car disappeared down the road, the storm swallowing him whole. When the sound faded, the house felt alive again, steady, quiet, forgiving. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger or victory, just peace. Dad's lesson had finally reached both of us, though one of us had to break to hear it. Months passed, and life settled into something quieter, gentler. The noise of my brother's collapse faded from headlines, replaced by other scandals, other stories. The house, once crumbling, now stood proud again. Fresh paint, polished wood, the garden blooming the way it used to when Mom was alive. Sometimes, I caught myself walking through the halls at dusk, listening to the familiar creaks, the echoes of laughter that used to fill these rooms. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt whole. One cool afternoon, Mr. Collins came by for tea. He always did things properly: pressed suit, polished shoes, the faint smell of cedar and old books. We sat by the window, the sunlight pooling across the table as he stirred his cup slowly. "You've done well," he said, his tone warm but measured. "Your father would be proud," I smiled, setting my cup down. "He planned all of this, didn't he?" He nodded, every step. He told me once, "If Daniel learns humility and Michael learns confidence, then I've succeeded as a father." He looked around the restored room, the framed photos lining the shelves, Mom in her garden, Dad at his desk, Daniel and me as boys in the yard. He always knew you'd protect what mattered most. His words settled deep in me, filling spaces I hadn't realized were still hollow. After he left, I stood in the doorway watching the sun dip below the trees, the sky washed in gold and violet. The air smelled of rain and old wood, familiar and steady. I walked to the mantel where Dad's photo rested, him in his favorite vest, that knowing half-smile on his face. For a long moment, I just looked at him, the way you look at someone you finally understand. "Thank you," I whispered, "for trusting me, for seeing past what I couldn't." Outside, a breeze stirred through the leaves, brushing softly against the windows as if in answer. The camera would have caught it perfectly, I thought. The quiet dignity of legacy, the kind that doesn't shout or shine but simply endures. The house stood still, glowing in the evening light, no longer a relic of the past, but a promise kept. And for the first time since all of it began, I felt not like a son living in his father's shadow, but a man finally standing in his father's place.